An African History of Africa, from the Dawn of Humanity to Independence. Written by Zeinab Badawi. Introduction. The Cradle of Humanity. The story of Africa begins not with kingdoms or empires, but with the origins of humanity itself. Fossil evidence points to East Africa as the cradle from which our earliest ancestors emerged. The Great Rift Valley, with its volcanic soil and ancient lakes, preserved the bones and tools of hominins who first walked upright. These discoveries place Africa not at the margins, but at the center of human history, the birthplace of all people. Yet the continent's role in this story has often been overlooked or minimized. For centuries, external narratives cast Africa as a land without history, ignoring the profound significance of these earliest chapters. By restoring Africa to its rightful place, the continent is recognized as the source of human innovation, from stone tools to fire, from language to community life. This origin story matters not just scientifically, but symbolically. It reminds us that Africa is not other, but our common ground. To view it as peripheral is to misunderstand the human journey itself. The soil of Olduvai Gorge and the caves of South Africa hold not only bones, but the evidence of creativity, adaptation, and survival that connect every living human being. Equally important is the story of migration. From Africa, early humans ventured out, populating Asia, Europe, and eventually the Americas. This outward flow means that every human being alive today carries within them a piece of Africa's earliest legacy. The genetic trail confirms it. Our roots converge on this continent. To write Africa out of history is to deny the origin of humanity itself. From this beginning, the history of Africa flows forward, a story not of isolation, but of continual movement, exchange, and innovation. The cradle of humanity becomes the stage for civilizations that rose, traded, clashed, and endured long before outside powers arrived. Chapter 1. Kingdoms along the Nile. Long before Europe built its first cathedrals, the Nile Valley nurtured some of the world's greatest civilizations. Ancient Egypt, with its pyramids and pharaohs, is well known, but the history of the Nile extends further south into Nubia and Kush. These kingdoms were not merely Egypt's neighbors, but its rivals and successors, at times even ruling as pharaohs themselves. The monuments of Nubia, temples, pyramids, inscriptions, testify to a civilization that blended African and Egyptian traditions while maintaining its own distinct identity. For centuries, trade along the Nile linked these kingdoms with the wider Mediterranean and African hinterlands. Gold, ivory, and exotic goods flowed north, while ideas, technologies, and faiths traveled south. What emerges from this history is a picture of continuity and exchange rather than separation. The Nile was not a boundary, but a lifeline, knitting together diverse peoples. Dynasties rose and fell, but the river remained a thread of cultural and economic vitality. By restoring Nubia and Kush to the narrative, Africa is no longer framed as Egypt's shadow, but as a region of interwoven powers. These kingdoms exemplify Africa's long tradition of political complexity and resilience, centuries before colonialism redrew the continent's map. Chapter 2. Trade, Wealth, and the Empires of the Sahel. Moving westward, the Sahel, the band of land south of the Sahara, became the crossroads of African and global trade. Here rose the empires of Ghana, Mali, and Songhai, whose wealth dazzled the medieval world. Gold from West Africa fueled economies as far away as Europe and the Middle East, carried across desert routes by camel caravans. Timbuktu became a symbol of this prosperity, not only as a market, but as a center of learning. Its libraries housed thousands of manuscripts on astronomy, medicine, law, and philosophy, challenging the stereotype of Africa as a continent without written tradition. Scholars from across the Islamic world traveled there, linking Africa into a global intellectual network. These empires thrived on their ability to control trade routes, levy taxes, and maintain armies. Their rulers, from Mansa Musa to Askia Muhammad, projected power not only through conquest, but through patronage of religion and learning. Mansa Musa's pilgrimage to Mecca in the 14th century left such an impression that European cartographers drew his likeness on their maps, crowned and holding a golden orb. Beyond wealth, the Sahelian empires nurtured vibrant cultural life. Timbuktu's scholars debated jurisprudence and theology, while poets crafted verses that celebrated both faith and earthly beauty. Families safeguarded manuscripts for centuries, passing down knowledge even in times of decline. These traditions remind us that Africa's intellectual heritage is not only oral, but also written, preserved in archives that continue to reveal their treasures today. The Sahelian empires remind us that Africa was not isolated, but central to global commerce. They show how wealth, culture, and knowledge circulated long before the age of European exploration, weaving Africa into the fabric of world history. Chapter 3: The Swahili Coast and the Indian Ocean World. While caravans crossed the Sahara, ships carried Africa's riches across the Indian Ocean. The Swahili coast, stretching from present-day Somalia to Mozambique, was dotted with bustling city-states like Kilwa, Mombasa, and Zanzibar. These ports traded gold, ivory, and spices for textiles, ceramics, and ideas from Arabia, Persia, India, and China. The Swahili language itself reflects this blend, a Bantu tongue enriched with Arabic words, evidence of centuries of interaction. The architecture of coral stone mosques, intricately carved doors, and cosmopolitan markets illustrates the fusion of African and foreign influences. Far from being passive recipients, Swahili merchants negotiated their own power in this oceanic world. These cities flourished as hubs of diplomacy and culture. Travelers from as far as China recorded their wealth, and African products reached markets across Asia. This network challenges any notion of Africa as cut off from global exchange. Instead, the Indian Ocean tied its eastern shores to distant civilizations, long before Europeans arrived by sea. The Swahili coast exemplifies Africa's outward-looking dynamism. Its story demonstrates that African history is not confined to the continent's borders, but resonates across oceans, linking it to the broader human story of commerce and culture. Chapter 4: Encounters, Invasions, and the Slave Trade. From the 15th century onward, Africa's exchanges with the wider world took on a darker tone. European expansion into the Atlantic brought the transatlantic slave trade, a system that would devastate communities and reshape continents. Millions were captured, sold, and shipped across the ocean, their labor fueling the rise of Europe and the Americas. The trade was not imposed by Europeans alone. It relied on African intermediaries, rival states, and local conflicts. Yet the scale and brutality of the system altered Africa's trajectory. Populations were drained, economies distorted, and violence intensified. Entire regions bore the scars of raids and depopulation. The psychological toll was as great as the demographic one. Societies that had once thrived on trade and cultural exchange became ensnared in cycles of fear and betrayal. The memory of this trauma lingers, shaping perceptions of identity and history to this day. Nor was the Atlantic the only theatre. Along the Indian Ocean, slaves were taken from East Africa to Arabia, Persia, and South Asia. Ports like Zanzibar became centers of this trade, supplying labor for plantations, households, and armies across the Middle East. The stories of these enslaved people remind us that Africa's exploitation was global in scope, affecting coastlines on both sides of the continent. Yet even within this darkness, stories of resistance emerged. Communities fought back, slaves rebelled, and leaders resisted encroachment. Africa's role in this period was not only as victim, but as agent, though its agency was constrained by the immense forces of global capitalism and empire. Chapter 5: The Age of Empire and the Struggle for Independence. The 19th century ushered in a new wave of European domination. The so-called scramble for Africa carved the continent into colonies, disregarding its peoples, cultures, and histories. Railways, ports, and administrative systems were built, not for African prosperity, but for resource extraction and control. Colonialism brought both disruption and transformation. Traditional structures were dismantled, while new cities and economies emerged. Missionary schools and colonial laws reshaped societies, often erasing indigenous institutions. Resistance was constant, from uprisings against conquest to subtle forms of cultural preservation. By the mid-20th century, the tide began to turn. Leaders across Africa, inspired by global movements and local resilience, demanded independence. Figures like Kwame Nkrumah, Jomo Kenyatta, and Patrice Lumumba galvanized populations with visions of self-determination. Though the path was uneven and often violent, the dream of sovereignty spread like wildfire. Independence marked not an end, but a beginning. The challenges of nation-building, economic development, and cultural renewal lay ahead. Yet the act of reclaiming autonomy symbolized the endurance of Africa's people through centuries of upheaval. Conclusion: Reclaiming the narrative. Africa's history is not a story of absence, but of presence, not of silence, but of voices that have too often been ignored. From the dawn of humanity to the independence movements of the 20th century, the continent has shaped the world as much as it has been shaped by it. The challenge lies in perspective. When told from outside, Africa's story has been cast as marginal or deficient. But when told from within, it emerges as a narrative of creativity, resilience, and connection. Restoring Africa to the center of its own history is not only an act of justice, but a necessity for understanding the human journey. This history is ongoing. Independence was not a final chapter, but a gateway into new struggles and opportunities. Yet by remembering the depth and richness of Africa's past, future generations inherit a legacy not of victimhood, but of resilience and agency. Reclaiming the narrative also reshapes the identity of Africans today. To know that one's heritage includes empires, scholars, inventors, and survivors changes how individuals see themselves and how the world sees them. This knowledge transforms victimhood into pride, despair into possibility. In reclaiming its story, Africa reclaims its place in the world. The continent that gave birth to humanity continues to offer lessons in endurance, innovation, and the unbreakable will to define its own destiny. Thanks for listening.
Did you enjoy this book summary? Got ideas on how we can make it even better? Drop us a quick note. We're always listening and learning from you.